to that limit. Thank you very much. We had an excellent debate. I now call Simon Clarke to move the next motion. Mr. Simon Clarke.
Thank you, Sir Henry, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I beg to move that this House has considered secondary school education standards in East Cleveland. And I've been prompted to seek this debate by recent Ofsted reports about two of the large secondary schools in East Cleveland in my constituency, Freeborough Academy in Broughton and Lawrence Jackson School in Gisborough. Both schools were rated inadequate on every measure of their assessments, and this is rightly a source of huge concern for pupils, parents and teachers alike. The report on Freeborough in particular was damning beyond words. Pupil progress was rated, and I quote, very poor, with a dramatic decline from the high standards set under the previous head, Linda Holbert. Even more seriously, leaders were unsure where pupils are for extended periods of time. Instances of bullying are not rare. When I visited the school earlier this year, I was genuinely shocked. It was the week the Northern Education Trust had come in to take over the management of the school, with a new head teacher, Mr. Michael Robson, poised to take charge the following Monday. The scenes were like a caricature from Grange Hill, with gangs of pupils just wandering the school during lesson time, flaunting their total lack of respect, not just for teachers, but for the whole concept of learning. I know the team from the NET have been working very hard to turn this around, and I'm looking forward to visiting Freeborough again this Friday to see what progress has been made. The situation at Lawrence Jackson is not in the same league, although that is clearly a low bar. There, Ofsted explicitly recognised that the appointment of Mrs. Jukes as head teacher last September has started the process of improvement, although at the time of the inspection in February, insufficient progress had been made for anything other than an adequate rating to be issued. Thankfully, the school has commissioned external advice on how to best deliver services like SEN funding and how to deliver the pupil premium, and I hope that will make a real difference in terms of the quality of the offer they make to children in Gisborough, although clearly things will need to be kept under close review. Both of these schools shine a light on the systemic challenge that we face in the northeast of England, and in the borough of Redcar Cleveland in particular, namely the gulf in performance between primary and secondary education outcomes. We also need to talk about why this occurs and move beyond some of the superficial debate which sometimes characterises this issue. If you look at attainment in Key Stage 2, last year pupils in the North East ranked second only to London for the percentage of pupils reaching the expected standards in reading, writing and maths. That is to say, we ranked second of the 9 regions of England. The think tank IPPR North specifically singled out the high performance of Redcar and Cleveland in its 2016 report, Northern Schools, highlighting how it excels at primary education and achieves results outstripping most London boroughs, which are widely regarded as the benchmark for high performance. However, by the end of Key Stage 4, the North East ranks 9th out of the 9 regions. We are bottom of the pile when it comes to the average Progress 8 score and Attainment 8 score. Whereas in London, pupils achieve an average of a fifth of a grade more than pupils with similar starting points. In the North East, pupils achieve an average of over a fifth of a grade less. Only 57% of secondary schools in the North East are rated good or outstanding, compared to the national average of 75%. In last December's Ofsted annual report, fully 10% of secondary schools in the North East were classified as stuck, compared to just 3% in the South East and 2% in London. Sir Michael Wilshaw in 2015 spoke of a divided nation beyond the age of 11, and that's a concept that really worries me, really worries my constituents, and speaks volumes about the way in which issues of social justice need to be addressed in this country. And what makes this particularly painful is that we know things do not have to be this way. Across our country as a whole, 2 million more children are now going to schools rated good or outstanding than when the Conservatives came to office 9 years ago. Only 4% of schools are rated inadequate today. But if you live in East Cleveland, you now have around a 50% chance of going to one at secondary level. And that, of course, impacts directly upon life chances. The proportion of 16 to 24-year-olds not in education, employment or training, stood at 15.2% across the North East at the end of last year, by a distance the worst statistic of any English region. When it comes to the proportion of 18-year-olds starting higher education, last year the North East had the second lowest rate, at just over 29%. By contrast, in London, that figure is 42%. To fix this, we need nothing less than a moral crusade not to allow the North East to continue to spin away from the rest of the country in this fashion, like a probe receding ever further into space. Because the point is, behind every one of these statistics clearly lies a child, like my own 3-year-old, a young person for whom opportunities are being slammed shut almost before they become aware of them, and for whom adult life is that bit less likely to deliver the fulfilment, both economic and emotional, that it is our duty to help to promote. I know the Minister cares very deeply about this, but we simply have to do better. I meet my local head teachers every term to talk about their issues and concerns, and I always come away inspired by the men and women I meet, by their determination not to make excuses and to offer blood, sweat and tears to do the right thing and deliver the best education that they possibly can. That same spirit is what drives the great majority of the teachers they lead, and I promised them that I would bring their concerns direct to Westminster and give them a voice. And that brings me to the central theme that I want to address today, that if we're to turn this around, we need to think much less in terms of geography and in terms of how the North East rates relative to other regions, and rather more in terms of the socio-economic profile of the young people who live in the North East. Because we need to end the situation where demography too often equals destiny. If my local head teachers were here, they would rightly say we simply cannot ignore the impact of deprivation, both material and in terms of aspiration, upon the challenges facing our local schools. Redcar in Cleveland is a place where great natural beauty and pockets of affluence mingle side by side with the grittiness of one of England's last great centres of heavy industry. Communities like Skinning Grove, Carlin Howe, Loftus and Liverton Mines typify those rural and coastal communities which have attracted a lot of analysis and attention from both government and think tanks in recent years. They're places where life can be really hard, and although my constituency shares much of the geography and appearance of neighbouring North Yorkshire, which is literally a stone's throw away, the reality is really quite different, and at times the gulf feels much more than just a couple of miles. As Professor Becky Allen has shown, if you factor in measurements of contextual value added that truly take pupil demographics into account, you can draw a very different picture of the relative success of North East schools. Now, in accounting for this deprivation, this is not to accept what President George W. Bush memorably called the soft bigotry of low expectations. I know local school leaders reject that utterly for their pupils, as I do. People from Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland are no less talented than elsewhere and should settle for no less than young people from elsewhere. And one of the most challenging aspects of life in the North East more generally is to make sure that we actually have confidence in our region, have confidence in our strengths, and are willing to go toe-to-toe with other areas. I think the confidence of the wider region was shaken very severely during the 1980s. We lost, with the decline of much of traditional heavy industry, a lot of our sense of place and purpose in the world, and that's something which has had lasting and quite complex consequences. And I think in focusing on these issues and in the education context, the real problem is not specifically that secondary schools in my region are worse as a group than those elsewhere. It's that they face these particularly serious challenges in terms of the profile of the pupils that they educate. Research by Mike Treadaway, which I'll share with the Minister after the debate, for Education Data Labs, has found that the impact of disadvantage varies according to the number of times that a pupil has been entitled to free school meals throughout their time in school. More specifically, the attainment gap for pupils who have been free school meal eligible just once in 6 years is about half that of pupils who've been free school meal eligible on every occasion. In a region where there is lots of this entrenched, multi-generational disadvantage, places like Middlesbrough and Redcar and Cleveland therefore face a particular challenge. What does that mean in policy terms? First, we have to deliver a fair school funding system. That's a matter, I think, of broad agreement. It was a manifesto commitment in 2017. The North East is not penalised as grotesquely as some parts of the country by the broken system that has built up over the last several decades. But I simply cannot explain or justify the scale of the funding disparity between different parts of our country. I know establishing an objective empirical formula is fiendishly complex. We are now having to wait until 2021 for a rational formula to be brought into full operation, and I would urge the Minister, please ensure her department accepts no further delays to the rollout of fair funding, and please go into bat for a generous school funding settlement in the Comprehensive Spending Review. But second, and more important, we need to look at how this education funding is directed for best effect. And I want to talk here about the pupil premium. Mike Treadaway, who I referenced a moment ago, has highlighted how the additional funding received by schools is the same for every pupil premium child. When he wrote his analysis in September 2017, this was 1,320 each year for primary schools and 935 for secondary schools. There is surely a strong case for differentiating this funding according to the percentage of time that each pupil has been eligible for free school meals. In other words, to focus the most resource upon those who are the most deprived, even within the pupil premium funding envelope. Treadaway has shown that this could be implemented in a way that would result in no change larger than 5% in terms of the overall funding for each region of England. But this would benefit areas like the North East, North West and the West Midlands, where poverty is clustered most densely. Third, and moving beyond funding, we need to align the incentives properly to attract the best teaching talent and leadership to our region. In her reply, can the Minister set out how she thinks we can best address the vicious circle whereby poor Ofsted reports, like the ones that have affected Freeburgh and Lawrence Jackson, can sometimes make it harder to attract and retain good teachers and school leaders in the schools where are obviously most needed? We must have hard-edged accountability, which is one of the reasons why I totally reject Labour's new policy of rejecting and abolishing SATs. But we must equally ensure the system supports those teaching professionals who are brave enough to get stuck in where they're most needed. Frankly, we don't need the most inspirational people in strong schools. We need them in the North East of England, bringing their talents to bear here, whether it be through salary incentives, professional status, the honours system, or anything else. We have to be more creative. And how does the Minister think we can achieve this? Beyond funding, my fourth priority is that we must adopt policies to tackle the catastrophic decline in the self-esteem and motivation of white working-class children over recent decades. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about the lasting impact of deindustrialisation upon my region. We know that children from other ethnic backgrounds perform far better than their white peers, and that this happens, astonishingly, almost regardless of whether those minority pupils are rich or poor. We can't hide away from this. My constituency is about 98% made up of white people, and indeed, of that, a predominant amount are drawn from working-class communities. Anyone who watched last year's BBC documentary, The Mighty Red Car, will have seen what a brilliant, amusing and inspiring set of young people we have locally, some of whom I've no doubt will set the world on fire with their achievements in the years to come. But what is the government's plan to engage these young people as a cohort and to challenge the all-too-prevalent culture that often sets little store by academic attainment and sometimes, at its worst, takes a perverse pride in shunning it altogether? In particular, can we target budgets for pedagogical research into how best to reach young people from these really deprived backgrounds and tackle questions like how best to teach an 11-year-old boy who's coming from a home where he's never had a disciplined structure? This leads to that awkward point where schools sometimes find themselves in the role of a parent or a social worker, and the amount of time and resource, both emotional and financial, that has to be devoted to looking after these children. It is simply not the case that these schools are inheriting intakes of pupils who are all ready and best equipped to succeed at the point of entry. How we tackle that systematically and fairly is something which I think needs the closest possible engagement, both by government and by civil society. I'm looking forward to meeting the inspirational Loftus Martial Arts Group in the next few weeks. It's a really good example of how the voluntary sector can play its part in establishing boundaries and purpose and teamwork and all the values which are needed to succeed in life. But it is also really important that government plays its role too. To highlight this problem isn't to downplay what I know is already being achieved, but it is to recognise that across the North East we have to do more and do it better. On that same note, I wouldn't want my speech today to suggest that there aren't some hugely positive things underway in East Cleveland as we speak. And of course there are schools that show just what can be achieved in our area, like Outwood Academy Bydales in Marske, which was rated outstanding last year, or Nunthorpe Academy or Huntcliffe School in Saltburn, which are both rated good. In particular, I was genuinely delighted by the 24 million announced by the government last October for the Opportunity North East initiative. This has a specific focus on closing the gap between primary and secondary outcomes. We know we can do it at primary level. We know that what we're doing works. So we need to make sure that the right lessons are drawn about how you continue that culture to secondary level. Opportunity North East came about, I think, in part because Damien Hines, the Education Secretary, joined me in Gisborough to meet local head teachers at Prior Persgrove College last spring. He heard direct from teaching professionals about the challenges that they face in our area, and he was able to understand their concerns and their priorities about how we put things right. As part of the package, there's a very welcome £12 million to provide more support for newly qualified teachers in the North East. And I really hope that this programme will make a huge difference, as it does seem to be targeted at precisely the right issues. With that in mind, can the Minister tell me, will the reports from the Executive Board of Opportunity North East be made available publicly, so that we can provide scrutiny, support and challenge? And if successful, will this programme be maintained so that its core elements endure beyond the 3 years initially earmarked for its funding? If it is to achieve lasting good, Opportunity North East cannot simply be a flash in the pan, but must become part of a new and higher baseline of support for the long term, because I believe raising education standards in the North East, and specifically in my constituency, to be a generational challenge. I also want to pay huge tribute to Tees Valley Careers, the £3 million initiative announced last year by our excellent Tees Valley Mayor Ben Houchin. This is an excellent programme of careers and enterprise education, which tackles all the Gatsby benchmarks for a really inspiring and effective set of careers principles. The headline feature is that every young person during their 7 years in education between ages 11 to 18 in the Tees Valley will have 7 meaningful employer engagement encounters, both internal and external, to the learning environment. They will also attend at least one externally organised fair or workshop per academic year that highlights the skills needed for the workforce. And of course, this is exactly what we need to see. It speaks to the wider mission beyond our education system, namely to ensure that our young people can go on to thrive in the world of employment, that they are not just educated, but employable, and that they have the right skills modelled for the local labour market to make sure that their aspirations are achievable. I went to Easterside Academy in Middlesbrough, in my constituency, last Friday, and we witnessed PSHE lessons. It was a Year 6 group playing what's called the game of actual life, and it was a really thought-provoking session brought in externally by an expert called Simon Carson, who's also a constituent of mine. And what it tried to do was to focus these young people, growing up in one of the tougher parts of an industrial town like Middlesbrough, on what it is that they want to do with their lives and how they can go about achieving this. And programmes like this demonstrate, I think, exactly what we need to be doing. If you ask the boys, too many of them, frankly, said they were going to be footballers. And whilst I absolutely hope that many of them go on to achieve those dreams, we also need to be making sure that they have realistic and understandable and equally exciting opportunities open to them. Measures like this should give my constituents real hope, I think, that things are going to get better, and that as we create tens of thousands of jobs on Teesside over the next few years, the next generation of Teessiders will be well equipped to take them. That outcome lies at the heart of my plan for my constituency, and at the very heart of my wider political philosophy. People across Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland don't want to settle for second best. They don't want to be at the bottom of league tables, and they don't want their children to be written off. And all branches of government, both in the North East and here in Whitehall, need to support my local secondary schools to become good or outstanding. And for as long as I have the honour to represent my home constituency, this will remain a cause I will continue to champion until we achieve this.
The question is, this House has considered secondary school education standards in East Cleveland. I call the Minister.
Thank you very much, Sir Henry, and it's a pleasure to serve under you this morning. And I would like to congratulate my honourable friend for securing this debate. I was very struck by his account of his visit to Freeborough, and he also mentioned Lawrence Jackson. I think he also, worryingly, he also mentioned the bullying, which, of course, will often go hand in hand with poor discipline, poor educational outcomes, and generally a school that is not really succeeding at its primary responsibility, which is to get those children into a state where they can learn, where there is sufficient discipline in the class. He particularly widened his debate to encompass the wider inequalities that the North East is a victim of. And he is quite right, Sir Henry, that there is a moral imperative here, and that demography should not have an impact on your destiny, young people's destiny. I have frequently said that it should never matter where you were born, who your parents are, who you live with, or who you know. Everyone should have a chance to get on in life. And we have to change the fortunes of those living in his region. Confidence is critical, he also mentioned that, and it can be a difficult balance to give the focus on educational outcomes, recognising where they are poor, whilst also building the confidence of the area. And I'm sure he will have danced around this issue. It is quite difficult. It is right to call out a school when they're performing badly, but the impact that can have on the wider community can be quite devastating. He mentioned, as I say, he particularly mentioned the poor Ofsted. But I think what then becomes a problem is the school then doesn't attract the pupils it needs, and despite successful efforts of new leadership teams, reputations in schools are won and lost, often with devastating effects, and that turnaround can be slow and difficult to achieve. He mentioned the visit of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and I know he is very proud of what he's starting in the North East. North East, as he said, Opportunity North East is a £24 million investment over a 3-year programme that will deliver widely shared ambitions across the North East to achieve rapid, and I think the word rapid is very important here, and sustainable improvements in the outcomes for young people. The programme is overseen by Lord Agnew, who will focus on 5 clear cross-cutting challenges, raising the attainment and outcomes for pupils at the end of secondary and post-16, recruiting and retaining great teachers for North East schools, because of course that is also the problem. When a school gets a poor Ofsted, the teachers often go elsewhere, increasing progression of pupils to university, including top institutions, and supporting young people to secure great jobs. He asked if the report will be made public. I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that, but I would strongly suggest, Sir Henry, that he has a meeting with Lord Agnew, who I think he will be impressed with Lord Agnew's approach to issues like this. He's a man in a hurry and won't rest until he sees things turn around. The One programme, I don't think he mentioned this in particular, but a key priority for the One programme is to unlock the potential of secondary schools in the region. Through the One Vision programme, a key part of Opportunity North East, 30 secondary schools across 11 local authorities will be partnered with high-performing school leaders and given bespoke support to raise standards. The ambition is to support these 30 schools to move towards at least Ofsted good to improve those outcomes, and to help schools sustain that improvement, because sustainability matters. The One Vision programme will benefit up to 25,000 young people and help them learn the skills and knowledge to unlock their potential. And I'm pleased to say that there are a total of 12 One Vision schools in the Tees Valley, with 5 in Middlesbrough and Redcar and Cleveland. And both Freeborough Academy and Lawrence Jackson are receiving support through this. Schools have already started to receive an analysis of need across governance, finance, teaching, learning and leadership. Leadership is so important in schools. Officials have consulted extensively with Redcar, Cleveland Council and with Middlesbrough Football Club on their programmes to help local children from these communities thrive in their transition to primary to secondary, because as he rightly pointed out, there is a stark difference. Let's hope that doesn't result in more people wanting to be footballers, because not all of them can be. But we intend to commission activities to robustly test the impact of the most promising approaches to improving transition. There are a number of other regional programmes that he might be aware of, and I won't go into detail about those. But I do want to thank him again for his contribution to this debate and for raising so well the issues that affect his constituents. I remember standing here probably 8 years ago, Sir Henry, as Public Health Minister, and we had a debate on health inequalities in the North East and citing some of the figures that demonstrated the appalling health inequalities that existed in the North East, and being slated in the press for doing so. I think the quote was something like, Public Health Minister says that everybody in the North East smokes too much, has sex too much, and whatever. But actually, you know, that is the tension. That is difficult. We have to, first of all, recognise the problem, face up to the problem, tell the truth, but at the same time, you need to put in the confidence in that community and the support it needs to change those outcomes for young people. As my honourable friend will be aware, I'm Minister for Further Education. Further education colleges do a fantastic job. Those young people who have not done well at school for whatever reason, some of that is disorganised, chaotic backgrounds, some of that is lacking of discipline in school, it can be a variety of reasons, but they're young people who have low aspiration and often minimal social capital. FE colleges pick those kids up and they give them the second, third, fourth, fifth chance. I'm pleased to see that with the apprenticeship programme in particular, and a move from many more employers who no longer focus on qualifications, but actually focus on the skills young people have. They might not have done well at school, but that doesn't say that they don't have real skills that, when developed in the workplace, can mean that they go on to get a good career and a successful future. All those programmes, I hope, will have an impact. As I say, Sir Henry, I would urge him to meet my colleague, Lord Agnew, because he's a man in a hurry, as he rightly should be. The North East, these figures are not new. I would urge him to go away and look at the correlation between poor health outcomes and educational attainment, because I think he will see a close correlation. This doesn't stop at what qualifications you get and the job you get. This actually leads into later life. So we need to do a great deal, and as I say, I know my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, is fully behind making sure that we make a difference to his constituents, and I thank him for raising this important matter.
The question is that this House has considered secondary school education standards in East Cleveland. As many as them say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is suspended until 2.